It is a dream as old as humanity, leaving the Earth behind, soaring into space, walking on the moon. In the 1960s, America did it. It was man's greatest adventure. Two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a Cold War. Both nations believed that whoever controlled the heavens would control life on Earth. America won the race for the moon. This is the story of America's race for space, from the shock of Sputnik to John Glenn's flight into Earth orbit, from America's first walk in space to Neil Armstrong's first step on the surface of the moon. Through it all, ABC News was there. Watch now the original ABC News broadcast of a great TV news story, Racing for the Moon, America's glory days in space. From ABC News, great TV news stories. With Peter Jennings, Ted Koppel, Barbara Walters, Frank Reynolds, Jules Bergman, and the worldwide resources of ABC News.
You might even compare it to the invention of the wheel. Certainly, it was one of the pivotal events in the history of mankind. But what made it absolutely startling to Americans is that we were on the sidelines. And it stayed that way for an uncomfortably long time, as science editor Jules Bergman reports.
The shock of the 184-pound Sputnik orbiting the Earth hit like a lightning bolt. It was almost impossible for Americans, used to being first, to realize somebody else had beaten them. It was a technological Pearl Harbor. Under President Eisenhower, the U.S. was pushing ahead with its own rocket, the Vanguard, for the International Geophysical Year. But for a while it seemed that the U.S. was incapable of doing what the Soviets had just done. When America's Vanguard rocket exploded on the pad at Cape Canaveral, the shock waves ricocheted clear to Washington.
We want to know why we came up second, why Russia has 2 satellites already launched, why we have none, what we need to do, how to do it, and when we're going to do it. And of course, the chips we're going to let the chips fall where they may.
From the President's office in the White House in Washington, D.C., we present an address by the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
The Soviet launching of Earth satellites is an achievement of the first importance, and the scientists who brought it about deserve full credit and recognition. Already, useful new facts on outer space have been produced, and more are on the way as new satellites with added instruments are launched. Earth satellites, in themselves, have no direct present effect upon the nation's security. However, there is real military significance to these launchings. I have created a new office called the Office of Special Assistant to the President for Science and Technology. This man, who will be aided by a staff of scientists and a strong advisory group of outstanding experts reporting to him and to me, will have the active responsibility of helping me follow through on the program of scientific improvement of our defenses.
The ABC television network presents Soviet in Space. This is John Rolfson, ABC Washington, with a special report on today's spectacular and historic accomplishment of the Soviet Union, the rocketing of a man into space and his safe recovery. According to the Russian account, the 27-year-old father of 2 young daughters, Major Yuri Gagarin, was launched in a 5-ton spaceship this morning, made one trip around the Earth in about an hour and a half, during which he made occasional radio reports back to Earth, and at the end of that time, he was safely landed in the territory of the Soviet Union, from all accounts, alive and well.
Gagarin was taken to a nearby town where Nikita Khrushchev by telephone congratulated him. Declared Khrushchev, "You have made yourself immortal. I will meet you in Moscow. You and I and our people will celebrate this great feat in the conquering of space. Let the whole world see what our country is capable of." Gagarin replied, says TASS, the Soviet news service, "Now let the other countries try to catch up." Now from Washington, with part of the story of this historic day in space, Here's President John Kennedy at his news conference this afternoon.
President, could you give us your views, sir, about the Soviet achievement of putting a man in orbit and what it would mean to our space program as such?
Well, it is a most impressive scientific accomplishment, and also I think that we, all of us, as members of the race, have the greatest admiration for the Russian who participated in this extraordinary feat. I have already sent congratulations to Mr. Khrushchev, and I send congratulations to the man who was involved. I do not regard the first man in space as a sign of the weakening of the free world, but I do regard the total mobilization of men and things for the service of the communist bloc over the last years as a source of great danger to us. And I would say we're going to have to live with that danger and hazard through much of the rest of this century. My feeling is that we are more durable in the long run. These dictatorships enjoy many short-range advantages, as we saw in the 30s. But in the long run, I think our system suits the qualities and aspirations of people, the desire to be their own master. I think our system suits better. Our job is to maintain our strength until our great qualities can be brought more effectively to bear.
Manual roll. Going to manual roll. Manual roll.
That was the voice of astronaut Alan Shepard, America's first man in space. I'm Bill Shadel with a special report on Project Mercury. In a span of 15 minutes today, Alan Shepard became a national hero, and the country's faltering prestige received a strong booster shot. ABC Science editor Jules Bergman saw it happen at Cape Canaveral.
Alan Shepard and America's triumph began today in the hot, humid darkness of the night at Cape Canaveral. Shortly after 1 a.m., he was awakened, showered, shaved, ate a filet mignon and eggs for breakfast, and made ready. Long before Shepard got up, thousands of missilemen were already on the Cape, manning their posts. They began the final 5-hour countdown, but the tricky weather nearly forced the shop to be scrubbed again. Deep gloom turned to nervousness and finally to optimism as the weather cleared. There were doubts. If the missile had blown up, if anything had happened to Alan Shepard, there's no telling what the effect would have been on our prestige or our space program. But nothing went wrong. Everything went well. While it was still pitch black at 3:55 a.m., we all got our first look at Alan Shepard today as he left Hangar S here on the Cape.
A doorway in the side of the astronaut hangar here at Cape Canaveral, and out through the doorway, Alan Shepard, slated today to be America's first man in space. Suited up in a shining silver spacesuit, he climbs up the ladder and into the trailer that will take him out to the launching pad. Behind him come the doctors who will accompany him on what is to be a 15-minute trip. And here comes the truck past our position. And on its way, picking up an escort car behind it, comes astronaut Shepard, walking down and carrying his air cooling unit, standing for a moment at the base of the steps and looking up at the gantry crane. Now he starts to walk and is making his way to the orange elevator with a wire mesh outside, puts his hand up for a moment. There is some applause from the 120 or so people. He's going up with, I believe, Dr. Douglas and another technician, the spacesuit technician. And now astronaut Alan B. Shepard ascends the gantry crane. In a few moments will be placed in his space capsule.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. After the hour.
Alan Shepard spoke from the wilderness of the minds of the scientists and the adventurers as well. Let's listen to the voice of the astronaut as he traveled.
Holding at 5.5. Cabin holding at 5.5.
5,000 miles an hour and then the ordeal of descent. The
capsule plunged back into the Atlantic. The film for all networks of the plane was ruined. But here's the scene as the helicopter carried the capsule with Commander Shepard inside to the deck of the aircraft carrier. Minutes later, Shepard emerged on the deck to greet the anxious crewmen and technicians waiting for him, who flew over from Cape Canaveral for a small celebration. That celebration, mild in comparison with the magnitude of his feat, already has taken place. Ironically, Shepard toasted his perfect plane, a huge shrimp cocktail, a roast beef sandwich, and iced tea. His fellow astronauts, who are permitted to talk, say he looks great, feels great, as these scenes upon his arrival back on the land would plainly demonstrate.
Some lawmakers want to award the Medal of Honor to Shepard. All today appeared ready to spend more money on our space effort. All agreed Russia is still ahead. But all this was beside the point for the wife of the first American astronaut. Mrs. Allen Shepard at Virginia Beach, Virginia, heard the news with relief.
Mrs. Shepard, could you tell us what are your feelings on this stupendous occasion?
Oh, I don't think I have to tell you, do I? I'm just so happy that everything went off according to plan. It was beautiful, I thought.
Can you tell us how you kept your serenity these past few hours and days waiting for the shot?
Well, I think...
Laura said she knew some weeks ago from her daddy. Did you know some weeks ago from her daddy, too?
Well, they had given us warning because we couldn't take this thing just cold, you know. We do have to have a minute to compose ourselves, so they had given us a little notice.
Well, tell us...
Laura being away, we gave her the same notice they gave me.
What were your first thoughts this morning when that rocket went off smoothly?
Well, I just sat there listening, and I just knew, it was more of a feeling that I just knew this was going to be perfect.
Pete Clapper, ABC, Washington.
The satisfaction, of course, was shared everywhere with every American school child. Let's call now on ABC Science Editor Jules Bergman to sum up the
day. A day of partial triumph after the complete humiliation brought about by Russia's success with an orbital flight. A success we have yet to equal. But now there are fewer doubts that we will. Now we know that Russia need not and will not have any monopoly on manned space flight. These shorter suborbital flights will be coming up regularly now, once a month for the next 5 months, with 5 more American astronauts crossing the frontier into space. And then sometime later this year, perhaps by fall, the first American astronaut will make his first orbital space flight. By then, Russia will doubtless have forged still further ahead. But a new spirit has arisen in U.S. missile men and in our capital. We may get beaten for years more. There are no quick, cheap, or easy victories in this game. But very soon the United States will have its own vastly accelerated space program. Perhaps solid fuel rockets, perhaps nuclear rockets, perhaps both. Out of the growing pains of Project Mercury, a host of new projects will be born. But today will be remembered as the beginning, the day the United States first tasted space. Jules Bergman, ABC, Cape Canaveral.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Gus Grissom in good shape. The trajectory is A-OK.
The second chapter in our conquest of space. And if anything, to us here at ABC News headquarters at Cape Canaveral, it was equally exciting with the first chapter, the historic flight of Commander Allen Shepard back on May 5th.
We are waiting now for communications from the recovery forces to confirm to us that Mercury astronaut Gus Grissom has left his spacecraft and has come up into the helicopter. I expect this confirmation just momentarily.
And a helicopter is hovering over and holding the capsule up. The capsule was sinking badly in the water, and that's the reason that Virgil Grissom got out of the capsule. The capsule has dropped. The capsule has been dropped by the helicopter, and it's dropped back into the water. Now, whether they can get it again before it sinks or not, that is going to be a major problem at this time.
Bill, I've got another report coming up to give us more information now. From correspondent Charles Batchelder aboard the USS Randolph, that aircraft carrier that's the prime recovery ship. So let's hear from him and get a fresh report now and see how astronaut Grissom is doing.
This Randolph, everything has settled down a little bit. The president has called to the astronaut, Captain Virgil Gus Grissom, and Gus Grissom's first words as he arrived aboard the carrier here And these are unusual. He said, give me something to blow my nose. My head is full of seawater.
I'll repeat what happened downrange in the pickup area. We know that the helicopter attempted the pickup of the Mercury spacecraft. We know that Virgil Gus Grissom got aboard the helicopter. We also know that some kind of malfunction occurred. The spacecraft was dropped in the ocean and sank.
I was elated, truly. We'd trained a long time. I thought we were off on a mission that was very important. I was proud to be where I was, and I was just concerned that I acquit myself very, very well that day on that first orbital flight for our country.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
I could see the booster falling away, and then could look back, and I could see that Columbus really was right. The Earth was round.
Of course, you didn't have this window. This was all closed in. You had just that little window back there.
Yeah, this was all the hatch here, an explosive hatch. This is the window I could see out of back here, and of course that's a more restricted view. I wish I'd had this picture window here. Then there was an indication later in the flight that the heat shield back here was loose. Now that caused a considerable consternation, obviously, because if that was true, I'd have burned up during re-entry.
Friendship 7, a real fireball outside.
I can remember during re-entry thinking that if that was the heat shield breaking up, I was going to feel the heat on my back first as it came through. You're dealing with heat back here on the heat shield of somewhere around 3,500 degrees. And you have an ionized layer out ahead that's coming back around that blots out radio signals.
Friendship 7, this is Kate. Do you read? Seven, this is Kate. Do you read? Over. Keep talking now. Friendship 7, this is Cape, over. Friendship 7, this is Cape. How do you read, over? Roger, reading you loud and clear. How you doing? My condition is good, but that was a real fireball, boy.
And you're proud that you're there, and you're there at a time when you can represent your country, when you can do something you feel is important for the country. And I think everyone has felt that way. If you didn't feel that way, I don't think you belong in something like this.
I've spoken to some people in the crowd, people who were here in 1927, 35 years ago, when they had a great parade for Colonel Lindbergh, and they tell me that it was nothing like this.
In the background, the clatter of portable typewriters as the newsmen of the world patiently wait with astronaut Scott Carpenter for the liftoff of Aurora 7, standing some 8,000 feet out across the palmetto and sand, shrouded still in that misty haze. The news contingent here is slightly less than it was for the first manned orbital shot of John Glenn. Nonetheless, the newsmen and photographers gathered on the press site this morning are just about as anxious as they were the first time around. There seems to be a general feeling of excitement, although most of the news people here have been coming here for several years now. They're used to the holes, the waiting for launch time.
The mission is essentially the same as John Glenn's 3-orbital flight. 3 times around the world, 80,000 miles at orbital speed, 17,500 miles an hour. A mission that will last an estimated 4 hours and 50 minutes from liftoff to splash in the Atlantic, some 800 miles southeast of where we sit here at Cape Canaveral, if all goes well, and it is a 3-orbit mission. As we said earlier, what we're really trying to establish here is that John Glenn was not unique, that he was a very ordinary man, though a qualified test pilot, that all of us can endure weightlessness, and Scott Carpenter is the second human guinea pig in that sense.
3, 2, 1, 0, liftoff.
America's 3rd manned orbital flight, the launching of astronaut Wally Schirra into a 6th orbit, 9-hour and 11-minute flight around this world.
The day is May 16th, 1963. With Gordon Cooper's record-setting 34-hour flight, Project Mercury is complete. Project Gemini is next. The first manned mission is Gemini 3 on March 23rd, 1965. The astronauts are Gus Grissom and John Young.
Now the Vice President and the astronauts are passing that ancient and historic Trinity Church, the Trinity Graveyard. They're just one block from being halfway up along the Heroes route from the battery up to City Hall.
Ignition. Liftoff.
T plus 17 minutes into this Gemini 4 launch. We should be getting ready for the America's first EVA, extravehicular activity, with Major White due to get out of the spacecraft over Hawaii.
The flight director says, get back in.
No, back in. Come on. We still got 3.5 more days to go, buddy. I'm coming.
The voyage of the Gemini Titan IV became historic yesterday when astronaut Edward White walked in space for 20 minutes. Today, the mission made more history by breaking 2 significant space records, and those are rare, to say the least. One of the records was held by the Russians, the record for orbits by a multi-manned spaceship. Cosmonauts Alexei Leonov, the Russian who walked in space, and his pilot Pavel Belyaev went 17 orbits in March of this year. Astronauts White and McDivitt topped that record this afternoon. And tonight, our 2 astronauts passed the endurance mark, set by L. Gordon Cooper in 1963 when he stayed up 34 hours and 20 minutes through 22.9 orbits.
A remarkable metamorphosis has taken place in these last 3 days during Gemini 4. The U.S. space program has suddenly come into its own, not dominated by Soviet achievements, and quite able, we now find, to do almost anything we want to. The first Gemini flight with Gus Grissom and John Young was short and almost seemed like another Mercury flight. But with Gemini 4, we've proven that we're grown up. Our technology is better than we expected, far better. So much better that we now can launch when we want to, or very close to when we want to, and fly longer flights than planned. Our technology is so good that Gemini, it is now clear, will move along faster than anybody hoped. And Apollo, the U.S. lunar landing program, will be speeded up. 3 more Gemini flights this year, next year the first unmanned Apollo flight, and 4 or possibly 5 more manned Gemini flights the year after that. And if all goes well, the first Apollo lunar landing flight may be in January of 1968. There'll be more Soviet spectaculars, all right, but unless the Russians are prepared to go all out, they're going to be swamped by the size and the accomplishments of America's space program.
Ignition. Liftoff. We're off on the hour.
You want to describe what the children's reaction was? Well, fortunately, they were nice and quiet until after liftoff. And just about time of insertion, Christopher started turning somersaults on the bed and using it as a trampoline.
Nearly 2 months ago, the ordeal of Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford began with Gemini 6 as the Agena rocket launched from Pad 19 on October 25th. They were both ready to blast off in Gemini 6 95 minutes later after the Atlas rocket was launched. They would have rendezvoused with it after a 5.5-hour chase through space. At 11 a.m. that morning, the Atlas Agena lifted off, and scarcely 6.5 minutes later, the Agena exploded. When the Carnarvon station failed to acquire the signal, Gemini 6 was scrubbed at T-minus 42 minutes. Schirra and Stafford had their first taste of bitter disappointment. Gemini 7, the next scheduled manned spaceflight, was to be a medical endurance test, 2 weeks in orbit for astronauts Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. But an old idea was reborn, a dual rendezvous. Gemini 6 would rendezvous with 7, though no docking would be possible. On December 4th, Gemini 7 was launched perfectly. Last Sunday, astronauts Schirra and Stafford were ready for another try.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Now we've got a shutdown.
The perfect launch was ruined by, of all things, a tail plug that fell out a split second too early. 4 days later, after 2 false starts, Schirra and Stafford were finally ready to lift off again.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
Engine start, and we've got a liftoff. 27 seconds after the hour.
The dramatic climax of the dual flight, the rendezvous in orbit of Gemini 6 and 7. After all its problems getting off the pad, Gemini 6 lifted off Wednesday morning with Wally Schirra flawlessly flying it and changing his orbit in a series of maneuvers that led him precisely down the orbital road to Gemini 7. 2:28 p.m., 185 miles over the Pacific. Gemini 6 slowly moves in on Gemini 7. A motion picture camera mounted on the windshield of Gemini 6 recording these continuous pictures. There's Gemini 7 about 35 feet off, its white adapter glistening brilliantly in the sunlight. the straps that seal the end of the adapter to the Titan II rocket top stage hanging out. And after a little more than 24 hours in space, Gemini 6 re-entered the atmosphere and splashed down in the Atlantic. Both Schirra and Stafford in perfect condition, the flight, they said, had been a breeze. And when Frank Borman was told what they'd said, he called it merely a local flight, as a joke between he and Schirra. The greetings aboard the Wasp itself. The hatches opened on Gemini 6, the famous Schirra smile and thumbs up. And then Tom Stafford hoists himself out, also in perfect condition and cheerful. Man's first successful rendezvous in space had been achieved. One of the most difficult barriers in space travel had been broken down, clearly blazing the trail toward a long road opening up in the future. The rendezvous of Gemini 6 with Gemini 7 was a brilliantly executed maneuver that almost overshadowed the marathon endurance flight of Frank Borman and Jim Lovell in Gemini 7. For nearly 14 days, Borman and Lovell outwitted mechanical problems, as well as fatigue, loneliness, and boredom, to prove that man can not only survive, but will function superbly on lengthy space voyages. They did their own rendezvous with their Titan rocket's second stage after burnout, whipped through 20 experiments, proved a spacesuit-off mode of living. They had trouble sleeping. They were cold. But superbly trained, obsessed with the importance of going the full 2 weeks, Borman and Lovell never faltered. And today, on their own, they flew Gemini 7 almost to the deck of the carrier Wasp in the finest Gemini landing ever done. The Wasp's island and deck lit up with welcome signs as the chopper touched down. And Borman and Lovell, unassisted, popped out. Borman first. A tumultuous welcome and cheers from the ship's crew greeted the two astronauts. After a brief talk with space agency medics and recovery officers on the deck, Borman and Lovell, lit up with smiles, began to walk through the brilliant warm sunlight down the carrier's flight deck. Lovell commented, "The deck seems to be moving." And both of them, still in their lightweight spacesuits, were a bit wobbly-legged. The entire nation looked on as live television cameras carried the picture to the mainland after first beaming the picture up to the early bird satellite. The IT&T live television was a smashing success. Greeted by Admiral Leonard and Captain Hartley, Borman and Lovell, Lovell's the man who looks like a razor blade ad there, both said they were hungry and very glad to be back. Today we concluded the most important 14 days in the brief history of the American space program. Our predominance in space is now unquestioned, but we can't be smug about our newly acquired position. It took us a long time and we had to come from behind. The Gemini program, once scoffed at by the Russians, is now ahead of schedule. Since March of this year, we've launched 5 Geminis into orbit. We've had a man walk in space, we've performed rendezvous, we've set a vital endurance record. The Russians have had 11 men in space, we've had 14. But this is no jingoistic numbers game. Each of our flights has had a different purpose. Each has taught us a new lesson about space travel. We're now more than halfway through the Gemini series. At the same time, we're about halfway to the moon. Next year, there'll be 5 more Gemini missions, each lasting 2 to 3 days, each featuring a spacewalk by one of our astronauts. Then the Apollo program begins. If we stay on schedule, we'll have a man on the moon sometime in late 1968. We closed out quite a year in space today, but there's much, much more ahead.
This is Peter Jennings at ABC News in New York. As you have already heard this evening, the 3 astronauts for America's first manned Apollo spaceflight have been killed. The astronauts died in a launch pad fire at Cape Kennedy. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration said the flash fire trapped all 3 men in the spacecraft 218 feet above the ground. Killed were astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward H. White, and Roger Chaffee. Here is the official NASA statement. The fire occurred while the astronauts were in the spacecraft during the countdown of a simulated test flight at about 6:31 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The spacecraft was 218 feet above the ground and was mated to the Saturn I launch vehicle. Hatches on the spacecraft were closed. Emergency crews were hampered by dense smog in trying to remove the hatches. The NASA statement goes on to say that an unknown number of launch crew workers were treated for smoke inhalation at the Cape Dispensary. The crew entered the spacecraft at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. There had been some minor difficulties throughout the countdown. only difficulties in the environmental system and the communication system. All data that NASA has on this particular flight has been impounded pending an investigation. ABC's science editor, Jules Bergman, knew all of the 3 astronauts. And Jules, the first question, even before we get to the men, is what might have been the cause of this tonight?
Well, it's going to take months to find out, Peter, but it sounds like an oxygen explosion. They were in the spacecraft at T-minus 10 minutes in this simulated flight, breathing a 100% oxygen environment. From the nature of the fire and the descriptions we've had, it sounds like a stray electrical spark ignited the 100% oxygen, which is more volatile than gasoline, and triggered the whole explosion sequence. This kind of thing has happened before in tests, not on the pad, though.
James Webb, the administrator of NASA, said tonight in Washington when he heard about the news at a dinner party that the spaceflight program would, of course, go on, that we had known that at one time or another we would lose some men. He was surprised, as everybody was, of course, that it should happen on the ground. But what effect will this have on the immediate program, Jules?
At least a 3-month and possibly up to a 6-month delay on the launch of Apollo 1, which this vehicle was to have been, excuse me, now emerge as Apollo 2. I would guess a 6-month delay until the full cause is found out, until full remedial action is taken, Peter. And it's a major setback in our race to get to the moon.
And Jules, a final question, which in reality should have been the first one. You knew Grissom, White, and Chaffee. A comment about them.
I'm too stunned almost to say anything. All I can remember is how much I loved Ed White personally, because I knew him the best of the lot, and Gus Grissom's own joking manner when I used to ask him what the most dangerous part of these flights was, and he would say everything from liftoff to landing. And this time, he never even made liftoff.
And for Chaffee, this would have been the first flight into space.
This would have been Roger's first time around.
And for Gus Grissom, the second, and Ed
Gus
White
Grissom would have been his 3rd flight, and for Ed White, our first man to walk in space, it would have been his 2nd flight, Peter.
The deaths of astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee bring the American space program to a virtual halt. 3 months later, April 24th, 1967, Russian cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov dies when his Soyuz space capsule spins out of control on re-entry. There are no more attempts at manned spaceflight for the next year and a half.
Good morning. The United States goes back into the space business today in 58 minutes and 52 seconds. This Saturn 1B rocket is scheduled to lift off the pad at Cape Kennedy and will carry 3 of America's astronauts into space on the first manned flight of the Apollo series.
3, 2, we have ignition. Commit liftoff. We have liftoff. This is launch control. We have cleared the tower.
Roger, tower clear. 12 seconds out and the roll program has commenced.
Apollo 7 is off and running for its 10.8-day flight. A 260-hour mission that gets the long-stalled Apollo program off the ground and into the era of its manned flights that should lead us toward manned lunar landings, hopefully, if future flights continue to go this well, toward manned lunar landings sometime late next summer or late in 1969. And so, Frank, it's been a long, hard time for Apollo, but it looks like we're off to a good start.
Yes, the beginning is certainly auspicious, Jules. Apollo 8 is now more than 120,000 nautical miles out into space, and the mission has been underway for 31 hours, 9 minutes, and 35 seconds.
And we're standing by here, Frank. I think the first TV pictures are beginning to come through from Apollo 8.
Well, we should get them very shortly, and that, of course, is the reason we're on right now in order to bring these pictures. Here they are.
There goes the first TV from Apollo 8, 123,000 miles out in space. That's Frank Borman in the center of our picture right there, Frank.
This transmission is coming to you approximately halfway between the moon and the Earth. We've been 31 hours, about 20 minutes into flight. We have about less than 40 hours left to go to the moon. You can see Bill's got his toothbrush here. He's been brushing his teeth regularly to demonstrate how things float around zero-G. Looks like he plays for the Astros the way he tries to catch this. I certainly wish we could show you the Earth. It's a beautiful, beautiful view with predominantly blue background and just huge covers of white clouds.
And tonight, the crew of Apollo 8 presents a Christmas Eve program from the heavens.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day.
And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
God bless them.
Unbelievable. That was the Copernicus crater. And some of what?
3 good men.
Roll 17. Program is in.
Roll and pitch program are in now.
Another of America's adventures in space, and this one, for the first time, will feature the manned flight of a very ungraceful-looking but vitally important vehicle called the Lunar Module, or the LEM.
It's a tale of 2 spacecraft this morning. These 2 spacecraft. The Apollo itself, referred to as the gumdrop, as you said earlier, Frank, on this mission, and the lunar module called the Spider, this morning attempting its first manned flight, its second flight all told. The LEM must prove itself on this flight if we're to get to the moon this summer, or perhaps even get to the moon at all this year. Weighing 32,000 pounds, most of that weight fuel, the LEM has 2 main engines, a descent stage right here, which has to lower the LEM to the moon's surface with the 2 astronauts aboard, and an ascent stage, which separates. The descent stage stays behind on the moon as kind of a launch pad all by itself. The ascent stage takes off to bring the 2 astronauts back up to the Apollo command module orbiting the moon, the mothership. They transfer back to the Apollo command module for the long trip back to Earth.
Oh, hey, that picture's fantastic. Dave, let's just hold it. Jim, let's hold it right there for a while.
The Earth live in color from Apollo 10. We're seeing what's happening right now. From 202,000 miles out from a tiny 13-pound live color television camera held by astronaut Gene Cernan aboard that small spacecraft now only 35,000 miles from the moon and 202,000 miles away from those of us on this planet.
But they are now down to 50,000 feet above the surface of the moon, and we can tell just by listening to them that they are seeing these truly spectacular and fantastic sights, and they seem quite excited as they move along closer to the surface of the moon than man ever has been before. About a minute away now from the Pericyntheon, or the lowest altitude at which they will be relative to the moon.
Right. After passing lunar landing site 1, as Snoopy has just done, that's John Young in the command module. After passing lunar landing site 1, they're coming up on lunar landing site 2.
Houston, if you read have Snoopy tweak up the high gain. We're not reading him at all, over.
They're coming up on lunar landing site 2, the prime landing site for America's first unmanned lunar landing in July.
Snoopy, Houston wants you to tweak up the high gain. They're not reading you.
If all goes well on the rest of this critical Apollo 10 mission, then Apollo 11 will be launched on July 16th. It's due to land on the moon under present planning at 2:22 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the afternoon of July 20th, a great event in human history.
Good day from ABC Space Headquarters in New York. It is July 20th, 1969, and man is about to land on the moon. Eagle will touch down approximately 4 hours and 17 minutes from now, if the flight plan as it is now established goes forward as scheduled. With me is our science editor, Jules Bergman, and we will be here from now on for what will be truly a historic time in the life of our country and in the existence of mankind.
This is Apollo Control. That separation maneuver was performed as scheduled, giving the command module a delta V of about 2.5 feet per second, which should give a separation to the two vehicles of about 1,100 feet at the beginning of the descent orbit insertion maneuver.
You got right down US-1, Mike.
At 40 feet down, 2.5, picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down, straight shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 20, down a half.
30 seconds.
Forward, just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Mode control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Griffin, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you... For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to Earth.
Well, well, well. A lot of things have happened since we last looked at one another here. Hello, Jules.
Back on Mars, Frank.
Band on the deck strikes up. Let's listen to that band, isn't it? President's applauding as they play Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean. Columbia, of course, is that module out there.
There goes the first astronaut. Up in the Billy Pugh net.
Up in the Billy Pugh net.
The frogmen had already wiped down the spacecraft's hatch with betadine, an antiseptic solution, an iodine-type solution, wiped down and sprayed the astronauts' isolation garments, sprayed their own isolation garments, sprayed the rafts and wiped the rafts down, and done everything except spray the Pacific with it, in what we think was a rather good piece of preventative medicine, just in case any lunar bacteria had found their way back and gotten away from the filters aboard the spacecraft's environmental control system.
These precautions against contamination, of course, is the second really new phase of this Apollo 11 mission, the first being the landing on the moon, and now the period of quarantine for the astronauts, their spacecraft, and the lunar samples they've returned.
Dr. Carpentier slides it open, and here they come. Here they come, the three astronauts, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, waving to the crowd of cheering sailors, moving swiftly into the mobile quarantine facility.
I was thinking, as you know, as you came down, and we knew it was a success, and it had only been 8 days, just a week, a long week, that this is the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation. Because as a result of what happened in this week, the world is bigger infinitely. And also, as I'm going to find on this trip around the world, and as Secretary Rogers will find as he covers the other countries in Asia, as a result of what you've done, the world's never been closer together before. And we just thank you for that. And I only hope that all of us in government, all of us in America, that as a result of what you've done, we can do our job a little better. We can reach for the stars just as you have reached so far from the stars. We don't want to hold you any longer. Anybody have a last word? How about promotions? Do you think we could arrange something?
The roll program in this baby is really going.
Pete Conrad reporting the roll and pitch program to put Apollo 12 on the proper course. Altitude at 1/2 mile.
Roll complete.
Roger, Pete. Seconds.
Mark 1 Bravo.
Altitude 1.5 miles now. Velocity 1,592 feet per second.
Oh, you got your GDC. Okay, we just lost the platform, gang. I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop out.
Whew. Boy, a couple of cardiac arrests down here is what somebody said in Houston, and I think that was fairly widespread around the rest of the country, too. Pete Conrad said he was not sure they didn't get hit by lightning. Well, that's, as I think you indicated, Jules, that's what they get paid for. They don't get paid very much for it, come to think of it, but they certainly reacted professionally. They got a go orbit, haven't they?
Right, Frank. There's the confirmation of a go orbit. You know, it's kind of like what happened to them. It's kind of like driving down the road in your car, and all of a sudden a blinding pair of headlights hit you, and all the lights go on inside the car, and you're in a heavy rainstorm at the same time. And you have to be able to steer a straight course and keep your wits about you. It's demanding.
Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me. I'm going to step off the pad, Mark. What is that profit? Hey, that's neat.
Here is a special report on Apollo 13. At ABC News Space Center, here is ABC Science Editor Jules Bergman.
The Apollo 13 spacecraft has suffered a major electrical failure, leaving the astronauts in no immediate danger but ruling out any chance of any lunar landing as of now. Seconds after inspecting the Aquarius lunar module, Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes had crawled back into their command module and then reported hearing a loud bang followed by a power loss in 2 of their 3 fuel cells. They also reported seeing fuel, apparently oxygen and nitrogen, leaking from the spacecraft, and reported the gauges for those gases were reading 0. And astronauts Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert are making their way through the tunnel to the lunar module, using it as a lifeboat, so they'll have electrical power for their radios on the command module. Apollo 13 is apparently also losing breathing oxygen, and the astronauts may have to use the LEM's oxygen supply. The emergency has ruled out any chance of a lunar landing and could endanger the lives of the astronauts themselves. A frantic scene we're seeing, a scene of deep concentration in Mission Control in Houston, where this abort plan to get the astronauts back alive has been conceived from well-worked-out trajectory data. The loss of that oxygen supply would seem to indicate to me that something had been hit or exploded back there, and also
had hit or caused an explosion in the oxygen breathing tanks.
Well, it appears that that is the situation. If they do have a loss of and are losing oxygen in the command module, that there could have been an explosion or ruptured a line, but this is pure speculation on our part.
Frank Reynolds picks up the story of the crippled Apollo 13 mission for ABC's 2020.
The astronauts don't know what has happened. They know they're in trouble.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
They have to go around the moon, but their present course will take them far out into space. They have to change that course and use the moon's gravity like a slingshot to throw them back to Earth. It's called a free return course.
If we could get back on that free return course to get us around the moon and back to the Earth, even though we intercepted the Earth in a manner that did not allow ourselves to survive, I mean a direct impact or something like that, it would be much better to end the mission in that manner than to be a permanent monument, to the space program by orbiting the Earth forever.
They have to use the lunar module's rocket, the one meant to land them on the moon.
This maneuver has to work. If it doesn't work, there's almost no place else to go. And as most of you are aware, there is no rescue possible in spaceflight.
The rocket burns only a short time, 31 seconds, and it puts them back on course for Earth. But it will take 4 days to reach the Earth, and their worries are only beginning. 4 days is much longer than the LEM is designed to last. Will it have enough oxygen? Will it have enough water? Can batteries meant to last only 2 days be stretched to last twice that long? And the LEM can't bring them all the way home. Only the command module has a heat shield capable of withstanding the 5,000-degree heat of re-entry. The astronauts have only one chance to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Thursday, 150,000 miles from home, the plan to bring the command module back to life is radioed up to the astronauts. It takes hours just to read it. And no one knows if the plan will work at all. The command module has gotten so cold that the ground fears the batteries may have frozen and the circuits may break as they warm up. Finally, it is time to cut loose the crippled service module. For the first time, the astronauts see the damage.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. Is that right? Really a mess.
Next, the astronauts pack up and move to the command module. The LEM, Aquarius, has saved their lives, but it is doomed to burn up in the Earth's atmosphere and must be jettisoned.
Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.
Even if the capsule enters perfectly, the astronauts and the ground fear that the heat shield may have cracked when the oxygen tank exploded. If it did, Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert will be dead within seconds of hitting the Earth's atmosphere. For several minutes, there is no word. The heat of re-entry blocks all communication. As the recovery helicopters take their stations, there is still no contact. In mission control, the wait seems to last forever. Long after they expect to hear from the astronauts, they hear only silence and static.
Capcom, why don't you try and give him a call?
Odyssey Houston, standing by, over.
Standing by for any reports of acquisition. We've had a report that Orion 4 aircraft has acquisition of signal.
Oh, great.
Hey, there it is.
There it is. Just as the three main chutes billet open. A beautiful shot.
Great.
A beautiful shot.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Photo 1 observes splashdown at this time.
After 4 days of reporting one crisis after another on this nearly disastrous mission, it is very good to be able to talk about the near miracle of its safe return. I think you'll agree, Jules.
No question about it, Frank.
Okay, coming down. Oh, what a nice day. Oh. Funny, there's not a cloud in the sky, except in the earth.
Tony, again, I'll say it with that salute. I'm proud to be an American. I'll tell you, what a program, and what a place, and what an experience.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May.
Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why 35 years ago fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1. Ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good. Ag start. Good over. I hear you have good run.